SNAFU is a podcast that contains adult themes and language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey guys, welcome to SNAFU, where the situation's normal, all fucked up. This is the podcast where we tell you stories of true crime, true mysteries, and truly fucked up shit that happens every day, and then we just forget about it. So we decided we were going to remind you. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Corey, and thank you guys for coming back to another episode. Now that we're out of the woods for our, Fatty Arbuckle and Virginia Rapé story, we're going to kind of change things up a little bit.
Yeah, we're going to go back to our normal, regular episodes. In this episode, we're going to do Winter Wonderland SNAFU, because even though we're stuck in Florida and literally sleeping with the windows open right now, we know everybody else is having a great time with some nice, cold, wintry weather, and we wanted to participate.
I don't necessarily know if a great time with any wintry weather is the right way to say it. But, because this is SNAFU, we're going to be going to, the best location on the planet.
Mother Russia.
Yeah, we're getting ready.
So in our Winter Wonderland, we have a couple of mystery stories set for you. So Corey's is a true mystery, and mine is a little bit of a mystery, maybe crime. So what do you have, Corey?
All right, so a very quick story for us. It's going to be a very short story compared to our Fatty Arbuckle series, but,
I feel like everything's a short story compared to that.
At this point, it's, the holidays, so we might as well just throw a quick story in here. We are going to be talking about the Tunguska event, which is an event that happened in Russia in 1908 and is still the subject of speculation today. We're out in Varnava, Siberia, and this is about, 40 to 50 miles from the quote-unquote epicenter of this event. NASA, of all people, has been out there recently doing a little bit of interviews and kind of gathering about a bunch of all the information about what happened.
Recently?
Yeah, it's been 100 years, or 110 years this year, but NASA's been out there in 2008, and actually a little bit more recently than that. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory in NASA is very excited about this thing because they don't know quite what happened. There's a few different theories, more outlandish, but the basic theory is pretty simple.
Okay, now I gotta know what happened.
So, like I said, we're 50 miles outside of what's the epicenter, and the first-hand account is this gentleman who's at the trading post, we'll call it. It's not really a general store there. So, at this trading post, we're from this indigenous man, but he's sitting at the porch of the trading post, and all of a sudden, he is thrown from his chair and feels like he's burning alive.
What?
Yeah.
Spirits.
Actually, all that he really knows is that the sky set on fire and he was thrown to the ground. This is 1908. So it wasn't until 1921 that a Russian mineralogist and his team had left St. Petersburg to come out to Siberia, but because it's Russia in winter, they didn't really get out there. They got turned back by the weather. The same mineralogist by the last name Kulik did get back out there about 7 years later, so 1928 he makes his way out there. And
wait, so it happened in like 1901 and nobody did anything about it for 20 years?
It was 1908, but no one really knew what was going on out there. All we know is that sensors in London, like seismology and atmosphere sensors, had picked up something happening out in Russia or in that area, and no one really knew what. And because it's such a remote area, people either didn't care or it was just impossible to get out there. But Russia eventually did get themselves out there from St. Petersburg.
Okay.
And, as he gets out there, he's trying to have discussions with any of the locals. And they're not the most forward with what's going on because they believe that it was a sign from one of their gods named Ogdi. And it was punishment. So he burnt trees and killed animals. Because when you get to the place, as you walk closer and closer to the epicenter, you're seeing all these trees that are just knocked over and felled in like a radial pattern. So they're like a giant circle coming out from the epicenter, obviously.
Aliens.
And as you get further and further out there towards the epicenter, the closer trees to the center are just stripped bare of bark and branches, and they're all still upright. We only have record of this type of situation happening only one other time. That's 37 years after the event, and that's at Hiroshima, Japan.
What?
So what we do know is that there's a huge blast based on the fact that it looks kind of like Hiroshima that knocked trees down. Everyone's trying to figure out what happened, what's making the giant explosion, the heat, and the sky set on fire. And that guy who got knocked from his chair, he basically says at one point, he finally starts talking to Kulik. Like I said, they were being kind of shy about sharing. That the sky split in two, and then it set on fire, and there's a giant explosion followed by a lot of smaller explosions, like gunshots or rocks falling and breaking. So theories kind of go a little bit crazier. They go from that God theory to
They go crazier than God.
They go to like a particle of antimatter or a mini short-lived black hole. But no one at first goes right to a meteor impact or a comet impact, because there is no impact crater.
There's what's in the middle?
Just trees. Like, it's just no impact crater. This is where it kind of gets a little bit trickier, because NASA's number one theory for this is that it was an asteroid or a comet that had come close to Earth and broke up and exploded. You know, some comet or asteroid that's about a football field size entering the planet could easily break up before it hits the ground, and then you don't have an impact crater.
And there's no signs of it? That's like a 1 in a billion chance.
Right. When people get out there, they're starting to take samples, and there's magnetite spheres throughout the ground and throughout all the trees in the area, and there's a higher percentage of nickel in the soil, which is all well and good, and it kind of relates back to an asteroid theory.
Yeah, it indicates that there are rocks.
And the only thing that is out there is that there is this Lake Checo that is a lot deeper than the rest of the shallow lake in the area, but it's still a lake. I'll explain that in a second. But yeah, so we have all these signs that it could be been an asteroid, and scientists were thinking it could have been a comet because comets are mostly ice, and that would have caused something to break up with the friction of entering our atmosphere. What's going on is they are calling it an impact event, but they're also calling it an airburst event. Basically, if you set off a giant explosion in the atmosphere, it's going to throw heat and fire and concussive energy down at the planet and knock these trees down. And that's what they're thinking happened. The leading theory is an asteroid enters our atmosphere, and while it's entering our atmosphere, from the change in speed to hitting the friction of our atmosphere to already being a broken rock, that it just started to break up in the atmosphere, and before it could even hit the planet, it exploded into a bunch of pieces, and there just wasn't a major asteroid that could have caused an impact. That's why there's no impact crater. But they're saying that maybe a larger piece had fallen into this lake that they found, but it's Siberia, so no one's going to be diving into a lake because cold. So that's what they're saying. They're saying that it's likely an asteroid impact. But the thing is, no one knows for certain. And what's a big problem with this one is that we have so many first-hand accounts because it was in recorded history. It was in 1908. And people were out there in the 20s getting these stories from the first-hand accounts. You know, there's other theories that are saying that there's gases stored under peat, which is like a moss and like a grass. And that the gases kind of started leaking out and stayed in a cloud because of the density of it, and then got struck by lightning, and that caused it as well, but that would have exploded some of the ground, so that's why they're not going with that theory. But it's another one of the odd, like, geophysical theories that are around this. The better one is the asteroid or comet near impact, and that's what the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is going on about, and that's just keeping some of the people at the Near Earth Objects Office at NASA awake at night, is what the hell was this thing?
Yeah, I mean, that would have been long before any of the atom bombs that we invented. I mean, that's insane that you said the trees are still standing there with no bark, no branches. Like, I would have said it was Russia testing weaponry, but it just wasn't what they were using at the time.
Yeah, I think what happened is it was more heat and the concussive impact of it that was going to throw the trees and everything that doesn't hit until you get away from the epicenter.
Is there radioactivity there?
Not much. No, like, they did test for it, and it's not too much higher, but there are, like, so the markers of asteroid metals, like magnetite and nickel.
I don't know. I'm still going with the alien theory, because if I've seen the pictures, and it is a big circle, like, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you think, like, maybe a round spaceship taking off would have, like, burned down some woods.
The thing is, it's 800 kilometers of trees.
No one ever said a spaceship had to be small.
I know, but it's like 800 like square-ish kilometers for these trees.
So I can't believe NASA's out there right now. That's crazy.
Yeah, they've been investigating it because it's something important. You know, they're trying to figure out what happened and trying to figure out if there was like a near miss, or I guess it would have been an actual hit, but it exploded because of our atmosphere.
Yeah, so that was pretty short. You're right. But you don't think it's aliens?
No, I'm gonna go with the asteroid near impact. It just makes more sense to me. So what do you have for us? You got something a little bit longer?
I definitely.
I know after, a 4-episode mini marathon of us, people are gonna want the longer stories, but right before Christmas, it's a little bit easier to have something a little bit shorter.
Well, okay, so I'm gonna do an oldie, but a goodie. And I know Corey hasn't heard this one, so I thought I would tell the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident.
All right.
Okay, so unfortunately last week, Bumblebutt, one of my other favorite podcasts, just put this story out as well. And I'm going to tell you, I almost had a complete little mini breakdown because I'd already been doing so much research and did not want to have to stop and completely start on something else. But then I realized everyone does this, and as much as they did a fantastic job, Corey hadn't heard this, and I wanted to go ahead and do it. So this is also a mystery coming from Mother Russia. And it's an older one just as well, but a lot of people are still talking about it. And in fact, in this year, they've gone out and resurrected some of the remains, and they've done testing. But let's get into the story itself. We're in 1959 Soviet Union, and it's a different time in Russia. It's kind of going through what people would call a renaissance, because it's...
Russia's a renaissance?
It's coming after the end of Stalin's suppression. Okay, it's been a couple years that Khrushchev's taken control over the Soviet Union, and yeah, it's not awesome, but it's better than what Stalin was doing. You actually have people like talking about ideas, and you have students like wanting to go to school, and a lot of people are attending more technical institutes. So we're talking about a bunch of students that were attending the Ural Polytechnical Institute. And they're students and graduates. And you have a group of about, 9 of them. And they're packing up for a planned ski trip. They're going to go into the mountains, and they're going to do a pretty long ski hike that's going to last a number of days. And so they're preparing for that, packing, getting everything ready. Because like we said, this is Russia. This is close to Siberia. This is not the easiest terrain. We're not going for a skip on the beach.
No, it's not a fun area.
So on January 23rd, the group was busy putting together their preparations, and they had actually chosen to do a trip diary. So that's where we get a lot of our information from about this whole trip in general. And again, it's 1959, so people actually write letters. They actually love to write down in diaries. They're very eloquent in their writing, and they're going to be taking turns in who gets to write in the diary every day, so at least they're keeping track of what's going on. So the night that they're packing, Zenaida Kolmogorova, she's a radio engineering student. She's selected as the diarist for that night and starts writing down everything everybody's talking about. So we knew that night they were talking about, damn, this won't fit in my bag. Oh, where's those scales? Just the random pieces of conversation you get from real people.
Yeah.
23-year-old student Igor Dyatlov, he actually takes on the role of designated leader for this group trip. Even though he's only 23 years old, he's known as very, stern. He's good at being in control. According to his hiking mentor and friend, Poloyanov, he commented that Igor had indisputable authority. Quote, everyone wanted to go on a trip under his leadership, but one had to earn the honor to go in Igor's group. I mean, that's a big saying, but also, again, these trips are not something easy, and you need to have skills. And this guy, that's saying also, this guy's not going to take people who don't know what they're doing. Igor was studying radio engineering at UPI, and despite the Soviet ban on shortwave radio transmissions at the time, his bedroom at home and at school just was a room full of self-made equipment. One of his major contributions to most of the ski trips that he had been on was that he would bring a handheld radio transmitter. So that way they could communicate between the rafts, between the mountains. But unfortunately, Igor wasn't going to be packing one of those radios on this trip. It's a really long trip, and they don't have the room for that. So here's the special thing about this trip. Every hiker in this group was a grade 2 hiker. This trip is really important to everybody because if everything went well, they were going to be awarded with a grade 3 hiking certification.
Huh.
And it requires the candidate to cover at least 186 miles of ground, with a third of those miles in challenging terrain. So again, this is not just a simple like we're going to go on a hiking trip.
Yeah.
Like this is specifically built to have difficult terrain so that they can earn the certificate. The minimum duration of the trip was to be 16 days, with no fewer than 8 of those days spent in uninhabited regions, with at least 6 nights spent in a tent. Like those are the rules. The new certification would allow them to be considered a master of sport, and it would permit them to teach others. So, like, this could technically be a job. I mean, it's a very big honor. So, you got the youngest in the group, and she's 20 years old, Lyudmila Dubanina, which we'll call Dubanina. She's a student of construction industry economics. I mean, these kids aren't joking around with their education.
Not at all.
She's actually incredibly tough for a 20-year-old. If you imagine, like, all those pro-communist, like, women dressed in the uniform, and that's her, actually. She's very, like, proud and strong and young, and on one of her other trips, she actually had been accidentally shot in the leg when another hiker mishandled a hunting rifle.
That's not good.
She had to be carried over 50 miles of terrain on that trip, but she managed to keep everyone else's spirits up. Like, she was joking and talking to them the whole way. Like, she's a tough chick.
Yeah.
And that's their youngest. We have 3 Yuris. You have Yuri Yudin. He's a 21-year-old student with a history of medical illnesses. It's so bad, like, he even had to take a year off of school. So he ended up starting to do hiking as a hobby, saying it helped with his various ailments, like rheumatism and that kind of stuff. And so he had, again, he's still a level 2 hiker, though. No disguising that.
I mean, yeah, that's still a good, for what he's got going on, that's a very good achievement.
Yeah, and so they just put him in charge of all the medical stuff. He's the one most likely to use it, so you get to carry it. You have Yuri Krivanishink, who everyone calls Georgie. He's 23, and he's the resident joker of the group. And he's also a musician who brings along, like, his little mandolin. And he's learning construction and hydraulics. You got Yuri Doroshenko. He's 21. He's considered impulsive and brave, and he, on another trip on his own, chased off a bear with his bare hands from the group. So he's
Russians.
like, yeah, these are young kids, but they're Russian and they're brave as hell. He's a student of radio engineering, like the first 2 we talked about. You have Alexander Kolovatov. He's 24. He's studying nuclear physics. He's a very methodical young man, and he's very big. And he enjoyed puffing on his antique pipe, and he kind of kept a little bit more to himself. You have Rustam Slobodin, which everyone called Rustic. He's 23, and he's the group's resident rich kid. He's really handsome, too. And all the pictures, like, it's weird, because this whole trip, like I said, they have a group diary.
Yeah.
But almost a couple of them have their own cameras, too. Everyone's taking pictures. So, like, there's pictures all the way from, like, this point when they're packing to when they're all the way in the mountains in the middle of hiking. And, like, half the pictures are just, like, if you put them in color today, you think it was, like, your scraggly buddy hiking in the mountains. Like, they're just happy kids who enjoy each other. And, sorry, I got a little sad. Anyways, Rustic is studying mechanical engineering. You have Nikolai Thibault Bourganoz, and he's 23. And he was a graduate. He already had a degree in industrial civil construction. And although he's serious, he's always looking for humor in the situation. So he's the other resident funny guy. So these 9 students took off for the train station early in the mornings on January 25th. And they're really cutting their timing close between packing and trying to get to the train on time.
Yeah.
They make it, and here's the fun thing. They don't even buy enough train tickets for all of them. So typical students, like, they get just probably like 6. And meanwhile, anytime the conductor's walking through the train, they're literally people hiding under the wooden seats because they're just not paying for that shit. So once on board the train, they end up meeting the 10th person for their group. And his name is Alexander Zolotaroyov. And he goes by Sasha, thank God. And Sasha is actually a 37-year-old man, which might seem really weird. Did we not just say the youngest person in this group is 20?
Yeah.
And everyone else is like 20, 23? Well, Sasha is, he's a local hiking instructor who had planned on going on an earlier hiking excursion with another group headed by a friend, Sergei Sogrin. but the timetable didn't match up. So Sergey connected Sasha with Igor, and Igor was like, yeah, he looked over what he had to do and was like, okay, you can join our group. So Sasha is actually a World War II veteran with a mouthful of gold teeth and a number of tattoos. He's not like the rest of them. But he's very friendly, and he enjoys singing along to Georgie's mandolin, and they're having a great train trip.
It sounds it.
That evening, Xena wrote in her diary, quote, I wonder what awaits us in this hike. Will anything new happen? Oh yes, the boys have given a solemn oath not to smoke through the whole trip. I wonder how strong their willpower is. Will they manage without cigarettes? We are going to sleep, and the rural woods loom behind the windows. After the train, the group took a bus to Vizay, which would also be their final return point, so it's their begin point and their end point. They stayed overnight before heading out on January 27th towards Oderton. The weather was really good, and the men in the group made a deal with a local to borrow a horse in order to get the group to the second North settlement on their trek. This allowed them not to have to carry their own bags, but the people in the group did complain that the horse was what was slowing them down. It was noted that Yuri Yudin did not feel good, and he wasn't going to be able to continue with the hike. However, he did want to make it all the way to that last stopping point we just mentioned, and he wanted to collect some mineral samples up there for the university. By that evening, the group found the site. It was an abandoned village of about 25-ish houses with only one good enough to stay in. The campers built a fire out of house boards, and quite a few of them ended up cutting up their hands just doing that, trying to pull those house boards off. And then the group stayed up joking and talking until about 3 o'clock in the morning. So overall, it's just, this part is the fun part. This is the hiking, let's hang out with our buddies and have a good time section of the trip. On January 28th, the weather is still good. It's around -8 Celsius outside, but these guys are used to that. It's what they're expecting. So Yuri Yudin and a few others collect minerals, mostly like pyrite and nonsense like that, before Yudin ends up packing up and turning back to the real world. At around 11:45, the group moved up the river Lozva, and as they trek, they're taking the lead every 10 minutes and then switching off. Again, they're very professional. One of the Yuris ends up hanging out in the back, and he's sketching the route in his diary as they move forward. So they're keeping track of where they are and where they're going. And it's the first night on the 28th that they end up sleeping in the tent, and they begin to set up that tent at about 5 o'clock. They have a stove, and that keeps their tent incredibly warm. In fact, everyone who ends up trying to sleep in front of that stove only makes it a couple minutes before they grab their shit and move off because it's so hot they can't stand it. So they have the supplies to keep them warm even in this very, very cold area. As they set up, the men are sewing curtains, someone's making dinner, they're just prepping for the continuation of their trip. And the group decides that they're having such awesome conversations that they need a whole nother notebook outside of their regular trek diary just to keep their awesome ideas in. Things like what their views on love are and society and communism, everything a big ideaed college student likes to while their time away dreaming about, right? On the 29th, the weather does drop, but it goes only to -13 Celsius, and the wind is pretty weak. So Nick, that's all we really know about that date because Nick was in charge of the writing of the diary, and he doesn't seem like a big fan of writing. It's on January 30th that the group actually spots a Mansi shed. So the Mansi are the local indigenous tribe to this area, and the hikers are actually very excited about this. They spend the whole hike just talking about the Mansi people and their culture and their customs, and a lot of them end up writing a ton of words in their diaries that they have learned from the Mansi. And as they're tracking in the woods, they're also following the deer trails that the Mansi have made because these guys, they herd reindeer, that's how they live. And as they're going through the woods, the campers are also noting that the Mansi tend to leave notes up on the trees. They dig notes to themselves in the trees to explain where they're going or what's ahead. But unfortunately, the hikers can't read this. They're just very excited to see it. Probably trying to figure out what they say and having no idea. So even though the weather's holding around -13 during the day, it is starting to drop to about -26 at night. And there is a strong southwest wind that starts to pick up and snow begins to fall. But the group writes that the temperature is pretty normal and what they expected for this area. And they do want to stay on those deer trails because off the trail, the snow is about 4 feet deep and they're trying to stay where it's easiest to move. The 30th is also Sasha's birthday, and when they stop, they sew the tent, and, they write that there's plenty of holes to fill the tent, but they do celebrate his birthday by giving him, like, a tangerine that he ends up splitting right away between the group. Happy birthday, Sasha. January 31st would be the group's final diary entry. So the weather is getting worse due to the wind. They mention the snow, but they say more or less it's probably coming off of the trees in the woods because the sky is completely clear. So imagine complaining about it snowing and it's not even snowing. It's literally just the wind getting knocked off the trees and it sucks. They did find a good spot for their tent during that day and it was warm thanks to the stove. But despite that, the temperatures are holding around -18 to -24. It's pretty cold. So when they pitched the camp for that night, it's nearly 4 o'clock, so they're pitching even earlier than they normally do. They had a hard time trekking through the snow this day, and they're really tired. So they didn't even have enough firewood to really have a good fire going, and the fir trees nearby were too wet to use. They started a fire with logs, but the group is just too tired to even dig a fire pit, which experienced campers would have made. That night, they all ate in the tent just to keep warm. It's pretty chilly, but like we said, that stove's working pretty good. And in one of the diaries, they even wrote it was funny how comfortable they were, even though they were so far away from human settlement. So they're still warm. They're still enjoying it. It's just a regular camping trip now, and it's getting kind of sucky because, let's face facts, they all get kind of sucky, don't they? On February 1st, the group gets a late start to the day again, and they only manage about 4 kilometers, about 2.5 miles, and they ended up going about 500 meters off their planned route, which is strange for such an experienced leader to do to his group, is lead them off route. They end up pitching their tent on the north slope of Kholat Syakhl around 5 p.m., and people find this strange because as experienced hikers, they're camping up on this slope when there's a whole forest just right down the slope. Like, it would have been much wiser to have the cover of forest to knock that wind off. But a lot of people suspect that they had gained the altitude and didn't want to lose it. Like, they were tired already and they'll just stay in the tent and be warm. And so around 6 or 7 p.m., the group makes dinner. And we do know that at least 1 or 2 members of the group exited the tent that night in order to relieve themselves because of the footprints that we see. But that's it. Like, we have no other word from them after this date. We have no idea. There's no diary entries. And frankly, no one's heard from them since Yudin left and they saw the Mansi. So February 12th is supposed to be the group's expected return date. That date comes, and Igor Dyatlov was supposed to send a telegram to their sports club upon their arrival at Vizhav. Hey, we hit our endpoint. However, Igor had also told Yudin before he left the group to head back that possibly they could be running a few days late. Maybe he already noticed that, shit, we're moving slow. It might take us a little bit longer. And that's pretty typical on, like, a camping trip, even one such as this. Like, hey, sometimes things happen, we're going to move slower. Expect a day or two of us being late. And so that didn't really raise any alarms that day or two. But after that, like, the families of these hikers start getting worried because they're not stupid. These people are Russians and they know where their kids were heading. And yes, they're experienced hikers, but it's still their kids. And we're not hearing from our kids. And it takes the rich boy, Rustik's father, to have him be the first one to call up the university sports club. Once he gets a hold of them, he's then informed that the director of the club, Lev Gordo, is on a trip and won't be back for several days. And until he returns, well, there's pretty much nothing they can do, which is not the answer I think any parent wants to hear or will accept. The following days, other family members of the other campers begin to call the university continuously, but they're all being told a variety of reasons why they haven't heard from their kids. Hey, the group's delayed, whatever. Excuses. There's a lot of excuses. It's not until February 20th that the university puts together a volunteer student and teacher search for these kids, which I just find really strange. Obviously people are volunteering and they want to give their time, but February 20th is it's a lot of days later. Eventually, the army and the local police force would become involved, and they would order helicopters and planes to help in the search for the hikers. So the head of the sports club, Gordo, and Inspector Blinov first approached the local Mansi village of Batyarova. So those local indigenous Mansi actually had seen the campers. So what Gordo finds out is that the campers had come through here several weeks ago, and they had stopped as guests of the tribesmen Batyarova, so which the place is named after, and they had tea with them. The Mansi even offered them to stay overnight. Hey, do you want to stay with us, camp with us? And the group declined. No, sorry, we have to get a certain lengths away today, and we're going to camp. Of course, remember, they had to spend a couple of nights in the tent as well, so they said thank you, but no. So after finding out that the campers had been through here but had not returned, Gordo and Blinov take back to the air, and they start heading west to the Ural Mountains. And they can make out the sleigh tracks of the Mansi also heading west, since it was one of those courtesy customs of the Mansi to escort their guest to the wood line. And so, like, they see the tracks of the sled that head out there, but they don't see any returning tracks of anybody coming back through this way. It wouldn't be until February 26th that the searchers found the abandoned campsite. Student volunteer searcher Mikhail Sherevin found the tent and said it was, quote, half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. Just cut from the inside, you know. And they also later stated that where the cuts had been, mostly had been around the places where the campers had sewn them up. Remember, every night that they stopped, they would have to sit there and sew up the tent, you know, from the elements, the weather that ripped it up. So when these guys were inside this tent, they needed to get out badly for some reason and didn't just get out the normal way. These guys literally cut down the stitching and pulled their way out of the tent. And once they pulled their way out of the tent, they fled. Some of them literally in bare feet, some of them with socks on, and someone with one shoe on. And all the tracks led down towards the woods. Those tracks were visible until about 500 meters until they were covered with snow. Probably snow that had fallen off the trees. By the forest edge, under a cedar tree, there was the remnants of a fire as well as two bodies. Yuri Krivoshenko and Yuri Doroshenko. So both our Yuris are there. And what we find is that these guys are barely dressed. They're wearing only their underwear and socks. But it's not like we normally imagine underwear, like the guys wearing them tidy whities and that's it. You think more like full body set of clothing that consists of underwear. So they got like a shirt on, they got underwear on, they got socks on. But for God's sakes, it's negative Celsius and it's cold as hell. Like it's not a good time, and this is not what you wear. Doroshenko's hand was burnt, and the searchers could tell that the fire that had been there had only lasted about an hour and a half. Nearby tree had broken branches all the way up to 5 meters high. Later, forensic testing would show that there was human skin embedded into the wood, indicating that the pair had frantically tried to climb the tree while snapping off branches and ripping off skin until their hands were just a bloody mess. Both bodies had livor mortis on the front side of their bodies, indicating that they had died face down and someone had turned them over after death. The snow around them had been trampled, and there were no knives around them, although there were branches nearby that had been cut by a knife for the fire, and almost all the trees for about 20 meters around had evidence of being cut with a knife, but there were no branches left. So all the wood, all the branches that had been cut down, and the knife, they're missing. And the volume of cuts also suggested that more than just 2 people did this. So they're saying that all the campers must have been down here cutting down these branches. Although the autopsy wouldn't be done until about March 4th, I'm going to go ahead and tell you what the autopsies would find in order not to get confused later on. So when it came to Yuri Doroshenko, he's the tallest member of all the campers. Once found, again, he's barely dressed. And he had moss and pine needles in his hair, but a little portion of his hair was burned on the right side of his head. His nose, ears, and lips were all covered with blood. His upper lip was swollen. He had a gray foam coming from his mouth that was on his cheek, and this usually happens after a pulmonary edema, as if somebody had been pressing on his chest. He had cuts on the inner surface of his right shoulder, cuts on his forearms and hands. His right armpit had bruises. There was a bruise on the back of his right hand and bruising on the shins of both legs. The amount of urine was a lot more than expected for someone who was dying of hypothermia because it indicated the body was still making efforts to fight off freezing to death. Death was 6 to 8 hours after his last meal. Yuri Krivonishenko had bruises on his forehead. He had damage to his temporal region, which he had like bruising around his temple, and he had bleeding in his occipital region, so he had bleeding in the eye. And a portion of the skin on his right hand is found in his mouth. His hands are torn front and back, abrasions on his chest, bruises on his buttocks. He had abrasions on his thighs, hips, arms, hands, femurs, and tibia. His left leg and foot are burnt. So this got crazy real fast. They're saying that skin in his mouth is from the back of his hand, as if he literally bit down on his own hand to either keep from crying out or maybe to try and keep himself aware as he started to slowly freeze to death. Either way, he did it hard enough to literally bite skin off and keep it in his teeth. And like we said, he's just all torn up. These two guys tried to climb that fucking tree all the way up to 5 meters high. These are like big cedars. They're not smooth little trees like you're gonna go up. It's just like a freaking pine that's gonna tear you to pieces. So whatever it was, 6 to 8 hours after they ate their meal, everybody ran out of this tent, ran down the hill to the woods. They started a fire. It seemed like all of them were cutting branches. There's no branches around. I mean, there's barely enough. There's wood next to these guys, but the fire only lasted about an hour and a half. And yet, these guys still froze to death. Why are their clothes missing? Well, some people want to blame it on paradoxal undressing, which is when you're dying from, like, hypothermia, your circulatory system starts to, like, shrink down. Your body is trying to fight as hard as possible to keep you warm on its own. Like your body, your brain, your body, it knows I'm cold and this is not working. And in order to survive, I need to get goosebumps. I need to constrict my veins. I need to start going into survival mode. And sometimes when your body goes into that mode, it feels like your skin, your body is burning because your body's trying to keep you warm. And some people will try and take their clothes off. However, on February 27th, between the cedar tree and the tent, they found the bodies of Igor Dyatlov and Zenaida Kolmogorova. And Igor was 300 meters from the tree, and Zenaida was 630 meters from the tree. Igor was found face up with his hands clenched in a fist over his chest, and his jacket is known to be unbuttoned. He had no shoes on, but was wearing Krivonshenko's sleeveless vest. So right there, we just told you what started to happen. These guys, unfortunately, passed away. All the hikers were there, and their friends died. And then they took their clothes. I mean, these, again, are still professional hikers, and it seems like they're in survival mode right now. And they know that to survive, we need as much clothing as possible. Which is strange why they left their shoes behind. Igor had minor cuts on his face, eyelids, and there was blood on his lips. He had a bruised knee. Both ankles had abrasions. Many small scratches are on his lower right forearm and palm. And he has bruising on the knuckles of his right hand, bruising on his left hand. Basically, he's got bruising such as if he were in a fight with somebody. He's got no internal injuries. And he's got 1,000 cc's of urine. That's neat. And just like everyone else, his cause of death is considered to be hypothermia. Zenaida is wearing 2 hats, a long sleeve undershirt, sweater. She's got a check shirt. She's got another sweater. It's got a torn cuff on it. Some of her clothing is inside out. Again, they grab clothing and then they just put it on. This is survival. This isn't about looking good. And also that tends to be a typical tactic of snow hikers. You get this wet, I still need the warmth. I still got to wear this. Flip it on the outside. Let that part dry. She had 3 pairs of socks on. She had cotton sport pants, trousers, ski pants, and yet she had no footwear. She had 5 rubles in her pocket and a military-style protective mask. So it wasn't like why she probably just had the change in one of those pockets. Jesus, it's a lot of clothing. But the point of that was nobody up there murdered these guys and took their stuff. Everything is still there. She had an abrasion to the right side of her face. She also had abrasions to the upper eyelids. and on her nose, cheeks, and bruising on the right side of her face. Something really took her on from the right side. She also had bruising on the knuckles, and she had a wound on the back of her right hand where she was also missing skin. And then there was also a long, bright red bruise on the lumbar region, which is the lower region of the right side of her torso. Kind of like as if someone had hit her with a baton. Like, that's the size and shape of this bruise. And she had about 300 cc's of urine. So her death was also considered hypothermia. It would take another 6 days to find the body of Rustam, 480 meters from the tree. All three died in poses that suggested that they were trying to return to the tent. None of the campers had mortal wounds on them, although Rustam had a fracture on his skull. Rustam had 50 centimeters of snow covering him when he was found. He was face down, and he was better dressed than any of the previously found hikers. He had about 310 rubles on him, and his passport as well. A pocket knife, pen, pencil, comb, box of matches, and one cotton sock were all found on him. He had hemorrhages in the temporal muscle, abrasions on the forehead, bruises on the upper eyelid of the right eye with a hemorrhage in the underlying tissue, signs of a nosebleed, swelling and abrasions on both sides of the face, bruises on both hands on the knuckles, bruising on the left arm and left palm, swollen lips, bruising on the left, and tearing of skin on right forearm. So, it gets worse. He had a fracture on the frontal bone. The coroner suggested that the fracture in his skull could be done with some blunt object. The medical autopsy suggested he suffered from loss of coordination due to the initial shock right after the blow that could speed up his death from hypothermia. They also suggested that all the scratches and bruises on his body were to be blamed on last-minute agony. And after finding these 5 bodies, that's when the inquest would finally start on the case of the missing hikers. So what it really comes down to now is that we have 5 bodies. Initially, you hear the story and they say, well, they don't have any mortal wounds on them. So they say they have no outside wounds on them, which isn't true at all. Like, maybe they didn't have mortal wounds, but they definitely all showed signs of wounds. Most of them show signs of a fight. From the knuckle bruising to, let's just say it, the bruising and swelling on each other's faces. Were they fighting each other? Something made them upset enough that they climbed a tree for 5 meters, breaking all those branches and literally ripping their hands apart. And yet, you don't see them like really abandoning each other. The 2 guys died at the fire. Now we have 3 more members trying to get back to the tent, the place of safety, the place with the frickin' stove. However, all 5 of them are considered to have died from hypothermia. And there's not much you can say to that until you figure out where the hell the other 4 hikers have gone to. We don't even find those guys until much, much later. And I've already read like all the autopsies on the first 5 campers, but their autopsies wouldn't be done until March 4th. And they were performed by the Regional Bureau Forensic Pathologist Boris Zozrozdny. Ooh, I'm really proud of myself for that. And then another medical examiner, Laptev. And again, all were found to have died of hypothermia, blah, blah, blah. Also, a couple of the bodies had showed livor mortis, suggesting they had been turned over after death. It's very important. And again, livor mortis, just where you're laying down, and when you die, your body stops circulating the blood, so the blood stops moving, and when blood pools, it causes a bruise. So, if you're turned over, whatever side was gravity, whatever side was down, that's where that bruising is going to start. If they turn you over, the bruising's not going to, move. That's where it is. It wasn't until May 5th that the remaining ski hikers were finally found in a ravine under 4 meters of snow by a local Mansi man. So there was still some searching going on, but it literally took almost 2 months to find the rest of the people. And it was just found by a local indigenous man. These corpses were better dressed than all of the corpses that had been found before. And it was thought that these 4 had taken the clothes off the others who died before them. Remember, even Igor had some unbinding done on his jacket. So after those guys died, it looked like they'd been turned over and things had been taken. Only a few feet away from them was an improvised den that they had managed to dig out in the snow. Remember, professional hikers, they know they're in survival mode. So they even managed to dig out a den, and they had laid down branches in the bottom of the den. So that's where all those branches went in order to keep them warm. Inside on those branches were articles of clothing taken from the bodies of their friends by the cedar tree. And yet all the bodies were found outside of the den. So the autopsies were done on May 9th, and this is what they said. Nikolai Thibault Brignol was well dressed, and he was wearing shoes, indicating he may have been one of the two that had been outside relieving themselves when everything went to hell. He had major skull damage. He had multiple fractures to the temporal bone with extensions to the frontal and sphenoid bones. So basically he had fractures all the way from his temple to his nose. There was no evidence of soft tissue damage, however, to the skull. So what causes a fracture? Well, maybe somebody hit him with a fucking rock. Well, sorry, there's not even soft tissue damage to show that anything actually hit him. He does have a bruise on his upper lip, and he's got a hemorrhage on the lower forearm. You had another body, Alexander Kolovatov, and he's also well dressed, although he's missing hat and shoes. His sleeves were damaged, like they're ripped up. His jacket was unbuttoned and unzipped. The waistband in the lower part of his trousers would actually later come back testing positive for radioactivity. He had a lack of tissues around the eyes, and the skull was exposed. He had an open wound behind the ear, and he had a deformed neck and bleeding underlying the left knee. And basically, there's overall putrefaction from watery elements. So again, it took 2 months to find these bodies, and every one of them had been covered with snow. And putrefaction set in, so, you die, your body starts to decay. You don't stay perfect, even if you think this is like a freezer. It's not like a freezer. Like, it's a wet ice, snow melting over your body. Like, it's wet. It's a wet condition, and it does help you to decay. He had a broken nose and an open wound behind the ear, and both of those were possibly from a fight. And then the last two bodies, both Dubinina and Zolotarov, had major chest fractures. And according to Dr. Boris Zozorodny, the force required to cause such damage would have been extremely high. He compared it to the force of a car crash. And I'm about to get into their autopsies, and you're going to see it's just a lot of damage. And yet, notably, the bodies had no external wounds, as if they were crippled by a high level of pressure. It's like they got hit by an invisible car that didn't show any symptoms other than internal damage. So Dubinina was also well dressed, and although the outer pair of clothes that she wore were torn and burned, and most likely these were taken from the pair under the cedar tree. Remember that both of them showed symptoms of being slightly charred, I don't know, from a fire. Well, the clothing that would have shown more signs of that are on her. She wore no shoes, but in an attempt to save her feet, she cut up a sweater, and half of that she wrapped on her left foot, and the other cuttings happened to accidentally fall off earlier. She had extensive decomposition compared to the others. She was missing her eyes, lips, and tongue. But here's the thing. She was also found face down in an under snow river, so like a little trickling creek. That's where her face has been laying in for 2 months. And like we just said, if you think wet snow is going to help decomposition, running water is not going to make it much better. Ribs 2, 3, 4, 5 on both sides are broken, and the additional 6 and 7 on her left side are also broken. She had a massive hemorrhage in the heart's right atrium. It's also suggested that there's 100 grams of coagulated blood in her stomach, and this might indicate that yes, her tongue's missing, but it might not be from just decay. It might indicate that she lost her tongue while she was still alive and she swallowed that blood. That's scary. That's really, really scary. However, cause of death is considered to be the hemorrhage into the right atrium of the heart and multiple fractured ribs and internal bleeding. So they do admit they didn't die from hypothermia. They died from something that beat the hell out of them internally. So Sasha Zolotarov, his eyes are missing, he's got bone tissue exposed, and he also has an open wound on the right side of the skull exposing bone. Again, 2 months, decay, but there is one that's not just decay, it's an open wound. And his ribs are also broken, numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the right side. Weirdly, he had a camera on him hanging off of his neck, so when he escaped the tent, he still had a camera around his neck and wore it the whole time. However, and most unfortunately for us, the film is damaged from the melting water. So whatever pictures he had, and again, we told you, these guys had cameras. This was a fun wee trip. You know, like, we have pictures all the way up to, I have a picture I'll post of, like, their last picture, and it's, you know, really, really white and looks really snowy, and we just have to wonder, like, what did he think, why did he have the camera on him? He's also found holding a pen in one hand and a small notepad in the other. He didn't write anything down. As soon as they found him holding the notepad, the investigators came running over, grabbed it, and then were just like, God damn it, there's nothing. Like, could there have just been a note? Could there have been something to tell us what happened here? Because at this point, it's a huge mystery. May 27th, there's a radiation analysis report on the clothing and tissue. And like I said earlier, they come back positive. May 28th, case closed. We're done. The official statement for closing the case given by Junior Counselor of Justice Lev Ivanov, well, the deaths of the expedition members were due to a series of mistakes by Dyatlov. On the 1st of February, he began the ascent to the summit at 3 p.m., even though he knew the difficulty of the terrain. Furthermore, and this was Dyatlov's next mistake, he chose a line 500 meters to the left of the planned pass that lies between Peak 1079 and Peak 880. So the group found themselves on the eastern slope of Peak 1079. They used what was left of the daylight to ascend to the summit in strong winds, which are typical of this area, and low temperatures of minus 25 degrees centigrade. Dyatlov found himself in bad conditions for the night, so he decided to pitch his tent on the slope of 1079 so as to start in the morning without adding the distance from the forest, 1 kilometer, to the remaining trek of about 10 kilometers to the summit. Considering the absence of external injuries to the bodies or signs of a fight, the presence of all the valuables of the group, and also taking into account the conclusion of the medical examinations for the causes of deaths of the tourists, it is concluded that the cause of their demise was overwhelming force, which the tourists were not able to overcome. And that is fucking terrifying. They died. It's really their fault. Something got them. The end. And frankly, I don't think any parent would accept that as the answer. I mean, these guys weren't eaten by bears. Why would they all just start having a sudden, all-out brawl with one another that required them to rip tents open, run away into the woods, start fires? Some people try and escape back to the tent. Some people are, going deeper in the woods and making a survival den. Something seriously bad happened. And 9 young, physically very healthy people died. And every single one of them shows signs of extreme damage. And yet that damage didn't kill them. Not according to the autopsies. Let's talk about what could have happened. Because that's why we're all still talking about it. Because it's never been solved. And all that's left are theories. So let's discuss the theories on what could have possibly killed these ski hikers. There's a lot of them out there. And the fact is we're still talking about this thing today because we know clearly that the real answer was never given. So let's start with the most clear and simplest idea is an avalanche. There's a theory that an avalanche caused the hiker's death. And initially, while popular, it's still being questioned. And it's being questioned for a good reason. There's evidence contradicting the avalanche theory, and that includes the location of the incident did not have any obvious signs of even having an avalanche. An avalanche would have left a certain pattern. It would have made a huge, wide area of destruction. Avalanches are just the rolling of snow collapsing down the side of a mountain, and it takes down trees, boulders, everything in its path. There wouldn't be a question today if there had been an avalanche and killed these kids. Had there been one, it would have been really obvious. The bodies found within 10 days of the event were covered with very shallow layer of snow to boot. They would have been completely swept away had an avalanche killed them. Since these campers have been in that area, there's been over 100 expeditions to that region, and since then, none of them have ever reported conditions that might have created an avalanche. So it just isn't something that happens in these mountains. Also, an analysis was done of the terrain and the slope and the incline where the tent would have required a very specific avalanche for it to even occur on that part of the mountain. And even that avalanche would have circumvented around the tent. Like it would have literally bypassed the tent and would not have hit them. And finally, as far as the avalanche theory is concerned, yes, Dyatlov maybe didn't pick the best place to put the tent down, but he would have never placed it in an area he thought an avalanche would have hit it. Like, and no matter how tired they were, he would have never put his team at that kind of risk. You know, there's that theory. We have a theory about infrasound, and it's another popular hypothesis, and it was created by Donnie Eichers in the 2013 book Dead Mountains, which we got a lot of our quotes from the diaries from before. Basically, he's saying that wind is going around the mountain, and it created a common vortex street, which can produce an infrasound capable of inducing panic attacks in humans. Like, it's just such a high-pitched infrasound that when the human body, like, accepts it, it causes panic. It makes, I don't know, it triggers the monkey brain in us all and says something is going to get us, something's out there. According to Eicher, the infrasound generated by the wind as it passed over the top of the mountain was responsible for causing physical discomfort and mental distress in the hikers. Because of their panic, the hikers were driven to leave their tent by whatever means necessary and fled down the slope. By the time they were further down the hill, away from the sound, they would have regained some of their composure, but in the darkness would be unable to return to their shelter. So the traumatic injuries suffered by the 3 of the victims were the result of their stumbling over the edge of a ravine in the darkness and landing on rocks at the bottom. So, okay, they ran away. Well, what would answer the reason why they're all so severely hurt? Well, they fell off a ravine, hit some rocks at the bottom, and crushed their ribs. Maybe. However, the last 2 with the crushed ribs were like the toughest ones in the whole group. I mean, and yet they had the worst injuries. It's a very interesting theory, if any. We have the paradoxical undressing, but we already kind of cleared that up. It seemed pretty clear that, yeah, they all left the tent in a state that they shouldn't have been dressed in. But once they got, like, their minds back together, they went back into survival mode and did realize that they needed to have more clothing on them. And I think more or less, unlike what we had mentioned before with them, you know, maybe they're too hot, they took off clothing. No, more likely their friends died and they undressed those friends trying to take what clothing they could to keep the rest of them warm. Finally, you have a theory in military testing. There is a speculation that exists, and I have to say that I kind of believe it too, that the campsite fell within the path of a Soviet parachute mine exercise. Again, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and we have the Soviet army who is now starting to go into the Cold War, and they're doing military exercises out there. This theory says that the hikers were woken up by loud explosions, and it scared them, so they fled the tent shoeless and shell-shocked. I mean, that's how loud maybe these explosions were. And especially if they were, like, percussion, like, who knows what they were using, but God, if they were testing, like, a percussion instrument, that's meant to confuse you. There are records of parachute mines being tested by the Soviet military in the area around the time the hikers were there. So parachute mines detonate while still in the air, rather than when they hit the ground. And it produces the signature injuries similar to those that the hikers had on them. Heavy internal damage with very less external trauma. This kind of coincides with the reported sightings of glowing orange orbs floating or falling in the sky around the same time in vicinity of the hikers, seen by a group 50 kilometers away. With this theory saying, yeah, okay, so everyone got injured and it confused them, and they're kind of saying, yeah, and then when you see Dubinina's, like, extensive injuries, like, on her face while she was there 2 months, and they're going to try and say that she was hurt by the military testing, and what really took her face away was, like, animals. You know, she died and scavengers came by and picked up what they could. There's also similar theories alleging that the testing of radiological weapons was going on, and this is partly based on the discovery that some of the clothing was considered to be radioactive. Also, the bodies were being described as having orange skin and gray hair. Like, the bruising on the bodies that were later found showed just discoloring of the skin, and it affected all the hikers. However, if this were true and something happened that would have affected the hikers, it would have also affected all of them, and it would have affected their equipment and the equipment inside the tent, instead of just some equipment, some clothes, some people's skin. What really is a better explanation for the discoloration of the skin that's noticed, by a lot of people who were at the funerals is that it's a natural process of mummification for bodies that are in cold temperatures. And if you want a comparison, you can look at the photos of these guys, and if you're brave enough, and then you go look at a 1,000-year-old mummy, Incan mummy from the Peruvian mountains, or go look at any other mummy from like a cold region. The body's, like, the skin coloration changes color, but it doesn't go always to what we expect it to be. What makes this theory one of the leading ones to boot is that the suppression of the files regarding the group's disappearance by the Soviet authorities is made to prove that it was all a cover-up. Remember, like, we found the bodies, we did the autopsy, and then we just gave this bullshit answer and we shut down the case. Like, the end. Well, it was pressured by the Soviet government to shut it down. And people point that out and also point out that there's not a lot of paperwork left on this that anybody could find to say, yeah, they covered it up. And we do know at this point that was standard procedure for the USSR. That's not unusual at all. And basically by late 1980s, all the Dyatlov files had been released in some manner or other. So it's not like it's always been a secret, but clearly, like, even those papers don't tell the whole story. And then we get to your theories that literally just come from buttfuck nowhere, and that is the Russian Yeti. So thank you, Discovery Channel, for all your educational shows that you do for us, because they're the ones in 2014 that came up with the Yeti idea. And they did a whole special, The Russian Yeti, The Killer Lives, that explored the theory that the hiking group was killed by a mink or a Russian Yeti. And it just basically goes off the whole premise that the hikers' injuries could only have been done by a supernatural, strong creature. Why we couldn't find his footprints, maybe he's a very small-footed Yeti, I don't know. But there's no evidence beyond that. We didn't even find Yeti hair. I mean, for God's sakes. And that's it. Those are the theories. Were these guys in an avalanche? Probably not. Did a Yeti kill them? Well, we'll never know, because Yetis are like ninjas, and you're never going to see one unless they kill you. And obviously it was smart enough to keep one of the guys from writing in his notebook as well. Or is it because the local Russian government was doing military exercises that some hikers unfortunately got caught in the middle of, and it caused such, internal destruction and panic that they all rushed out into the Siberian nights, and they all died there, unfortunately. Hopefully one day we'll know. But as of right now, we don't, and I'd love to hear your theories on it. Maybe someone's got some alien theories, because we've seen that coming out of Russia too. But that's going to be it. And if you guys are wondering why you haven't heard Corey in the last hour, it's because, unfortunately, Corey had to go catch a plane in the middle of recording. Sadly, Corey and his family are going through a grieving time, and he's lost his grandfather, and we're all very sorry for him, especially now that it's happening around Christmas. And we're just wishing him the best and hoping that being around family, even in such a sad time, is still going to be good, because it's Christmas. And so that being said, I won't be taking a break, and I will be putting out another episode next week to give you guys a little escape from your Christmas families. And until then, you can write us, you can tweet us, you can Instagram us. I am on those platforms, and I answered everything. But if you're wondering how you could really help the show, you can really help the show out by going on iTunes and leaving a 5-star review, and also leaving a personal, a review. I'd love to see what words you have to say about us, and it'll help us so much better to get seen. Unfortunately, that's all iTunes seems to care about is the reviews, and until we get some more of those, we don't get seen as much, and I'm kind of starting to wonder if we're getting seen at all, but I know we have some fantastic fans, and I've heard from quite a few of you, and I'm so grateful. Please keep your messages coming. I appreciate them. And until then, take care of yourself, because the situation's normal, all fucked up, and you know it. Bye, guys.